welcome everybody to this event. It's absolutely tremendous, and I'm particularly delighted that CEH is the first innovation center that I'm being involved in bringing into Leaf. So for those of you I've not had the privilege of meeting before, my name's David. I've worked with Leaf, around Leaf, for getting on for the best part of 15, 20 years now, and I knew Caroline obviously very well in that context, and obviously it's very sad indeed that Caroline passed away. And so it's bittersweet joining the organization. So I've come in from industry. So prior to joining Leaf, I was the Director of Sustainability for the UK grocery division of Associated British Foods. And I came into Associated British Foods from work I'd done with Jordan cereals that were acquired by ABF in about 2007, 2008. So Jordan cereals, for those of you who don't know, do an awful lot of work putting wildlife biodiversity habitats onto farmland, and they have done that for the best part of 40 years, initially under the ownership of the Jordan's family. So, and it was in that context actually that I first came across CEH. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a moment or two, but I was delighted to meet for the first time actually the other week with Professor Richard Pywell, who's on the call today. And Richard's work has been instrumental in shaping my thinking around what do businesses need to do to engage with the topic of biodiversity and farming. And I think actually, when I think about actually the role of Leaf as an organization, this point about interconnecting us, bringing people together, that really is the core function of Leaf as an organization, is connecting together different audiences, different communities and groups that have an interest in or around sustainability in agriculture. And the organization that's grown up over the last 30 years under Caroline, and which I've inherited coming into it now as the incoming CEO, is really quite extraordinary. And given the pressures that we're facing into around the need to engage with sustainability in agriculture, I think I'm just delighted that we have the opportunity to work with CEH in the context of our broader work. I have a slide which I'm just going to show you very briefly, just to summarize the full extent of what Leaf does in pictorially, because I'm sure some of you will be aware of some of the work that we do, but maybe not the full span of it. So on one hand, and this is really where today fits in, we are advocates for integrated farm management, for the application of data, of insight, of management towards a broad-based solution on sustainability. And we'll come on to this in a moment, but the organization has tremendous links both into academic institutions and into farming to promote the adoption of management-driven solutions to address sustainability. Linked to that, we also operate the Leaf Mark standard, and I believe my colleague Claire is also on the call today, who oversees that work. So Leaf Mark was again founded by Caroline, I think just over 20 years ago now, and again tries to put a framework around sustainable farming practice that can be translated to help businesses connect their supply chains through robust standards and build trust with consumers around where food is coming from and how it has been produced. And then finally, the other side of Leaf, which I think you may not be quite so well aware of, is the massive amount of work that the organization does on educational engagement. So last year alone, the Leaf education team met with 39,000 children and took them onto working farms. They operate the very well-known Open Farm Sunday event, through which over 180,000 people went onto farms and saw firsthand farming and engaged with farming, many of whom are not from farming backgrounds. So huge amounts of outreach linked to the promotion of agriculture and sustainability in an interconnected way. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the importance of networks. So if I could have the next slide, please. I think it's critical as we face into the incredible changes that are hitting agriculture at the moment, that we reflect deeply upon the need for partnership and network and interconnectivity of ideas and thinking. And in that context, CEH it's just absolutely wonderful that we're going to be working much more closely with you. Leaf is an extraordinary organization in that regard. We have a very, very wide network. So we've got a connection of 18 now innovation centers, including CEH, 40 demonstration farms, and and then we link into over 100 corporate members, so organizations such as the UK retailers, but also more broadly into framework standards organizations like Red Tractor and Global Gap, and equivalent standards in other countries. So CESA, I put the logo for the CESA there. This interconnectivity of multiple different intervention points, absolutely critical to shaping the frameworks of models for action that we are asking farmers to employ in managing their land and in imagining the production of food on their land to reflect the broad range of criteria that constitute sustainability. Sustainability is not about one thing. Sustainability is about multiple different interventions. Just to illustrate the network, I think I just saw the slide flash up in front of me. There is a slide which just shows what that network looks like in the UK. This is a very, very broad-based set of farms, many different types of farms, many different types of innovation centers with specialisms in different aspects of food and food production. And I just wanted to talk before I hand over to Claire. I just wanted to talk very briefly about my own experience of CEH and CEH's data, because one of the things which I'm very conscious of is that we all share the same desire to change the system, to make a better system. But within that network and within that approach, we often bring with it slightly different expectations and understandings of how data might be applied and to what end. And I think one of the critical things that LEAF can do is to help different organizations with different areas of expertise talk to one another in a way that resonates and can be turned into applied action for change. So if I could find the last slide, it's this is just a photograph of of some signage in a field which was this is part of the conservation grade farming scheme, which used to be operated by Jordans about 15, 16 years ago. And now this is morphed into the Jordans Farm Partnership. But the reason I'm referencing it, because at that time, and I think this would have been late 2000s, CEH under Professor Pywell did some significant amount of work with Jordans to quantify the impact of habitat placement on the lands within that were in the Jordans farming scheme. So Jordans purchased oats from about 40 UK farmers, all of whom were paid a premium for placing wildlife habitat on their land, and the business wanted to understand exactly what the impact of those habitats were. And a very detailed piece of analysis was undertaken over I think it was a 3-year period of work, looking at the placement of looking at the incidence of particular taxa species on the farms. And the reason I mention this is because I want to just draw out some of both the drivers for why that work was important in the context of the commercial business, and also the implications of the output from the research. So the drivers of it really were multiple. One, we wanted to demonstrate that the interventions we were making were having an impact, so that we could secure more funding, so that we could persuade others of the fact that supporting the Jordan cereal brand was a positive thing. And in particular, our marketing colleagues wanted numbers, things which could be help translate the complexity of biodiversity and ecosystems into language which could be understood by the average members of the public. So I seem to recall we landed on 5-fold more wildlife on a Jordan's farm. The second point, which I think which really stayed with me over many years as I went through my career in ABF, was just what the data actually showed. And the data which came back was really fascinating in so much as it showed massive movements in wildlife numbers from year to year, whilst the habitat itself stayed the same. And I started to realize as a manager that some of the things which we were engaging with in terms of driving sustainability onto the farms were actually far bigger than anything that we could control as a business. And what mattered first and foremost was the placement and the quality of the habitat that we were putting on the land. And that might sound completely obvious, and particularly to the scientists on the call, but from a management point of view, it was very significant, because from a business management perspective, we were faced with conundrums all the time about where should we be placing our resources, how much money do we put into habitat creation, how much do we put into aspects of evaluation. All of these issues were being constantly faced with us as we were under pressure on our costs. So understanding the implications of the actions that we were taking was absolutely critical. Now, from my perspective, and I'm just completely delighted that CEH are joining today, I just think the data, the output, having visited your offices in Oxfordshire a couple of weeks ago, the capability of the technology that exists now is way beyond anything that was possible 15 years ago. Enormously exciting materials which I was shown. I think there's such an opportunity now as the markets realize that we need to engage more fully with sustainability, to connect that data, to connect that output, not just into our farming network, but to connect it into the corporate supporters that sit behind LEAF as an organization, to help them understand the art of the possible and how we can optimize farming systems in a way that maximizes the environmental impact, but also gives them the data and the confidence that where they're placing their resources in terms of their money or their time is having the biggest possible impact. I know the presentations you're about to see will bring all of that to life. And there are many. I've just seen a short video with somebody from the days when I worked at Jordan's in it, who is still very, very active in this world. It's so exciting. I'm delighted that we're going to be working together, and very, very much to look forward to the conversation today and to building on our links into the future. So I may at this point hand over to Claire.
Thank you, David. That was brilliant. So as David says, hand over to Claire.
Thank you very much, David. Good morning, everyone. And can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. So thank you so much to Dan and Megan for organising today's webinar. And it's a real pleasure to be able to speak today. We're really excited as UKCEH to be joining LEAF as your 18th Innovation Centre. And yeah, but just wonderful to look forward to the opportunities that that's going to bring, and of course to continue the relationship that we've had going forward with, again, many of your farmers as well. Sorry about the slides. So yeah, my name's Claire, and I'm going to introduce UKCEH and also Ag Zero Plus, which is our kind of main sustainable agriculture programme that's ongoing at the moment. So who are the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology? So we are an independent and not-for-profit research institute. We specialise in integrated, particularly integrated environmental monitoring and solutions, and that's across land, water and air. And our research reaches internationally, as well as focusing in the UK. We are home to more than 600 staff, that's more than 500 science staff and infrastructure staff, and 160 postgraduate students, and we're based across 4 sites in the UK. So Richard and Ben and I are based in Wallingford in South Oxfordshire, and we have research sites also in North Wales at Bangor, at Lancaster, and up in near Edinburgh. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a kind of storyline or a little bit of track record as to how we kind of got to where we are now, in particular with kind of the area of research that sits under Richard's science area, which is broadly biodiversity and land use. So back in the 1960s, with the Nature Conservancy Council and then the Institute for Terrestrial Ecology, our colleagues up at the Monks Wood Research Station in Cambridgeshire were instrumental in linking the use of organochloride pesticides to declines in predatory birds. And indeed, UKCEH still runs the UK predatory bird monitoring scheme. In the 1980s, with the launch of things like the UK Countryside Survey and these national scale mapping facilities. Is
my Outlook working? Is my...
And flowers from the countryside. Yeah. And then through the 1990s, our research and monitoring was beginning to underpin the development of agri-environment schemes. Coming into the 2000s, we then co-led with Rothamsted Research and others, the farm scale evaluation of GM crops, a huge number of field trials in that programme. And then coming more recently, around 2016, Richard and Ben in particular were leading research on looking at the impacts of neonicotinoid pesticides, particularly on pollinating insects. Coming to the present, about 7 or 8 years ago, we began a research programme called ASSIST, which stands for Achieving Sustainable Agricultural Systems. And this was bringing together a lot of the research that David's already mentioned, looking at on-farm management interventions, but really bringing it into a more kind of holistic and integrated context. And indeed, the Ag Zero programme takes us even beyond ASSIST, as you'll hear in the next few slides. So Ag Zero Plus, I'm going to just introduce the programme and then hand over to Ben and then Richard. So just as a bit of background, I'm sure, again, I don't need to go over these points really with most of you, but of course we're aware that agriculture is a major and increasing source of greenhouse gas emissions. And indeed, the UK has repeatedly failed to meet the Climate Change Committee's progress indicators. So achieving that 6th carbon budget and coming forward to the 7th carbon budget and net zero by 2050 will require a 30% reduction in emissions. And this is clearly a really complex and challenging sector. Delivery of solutions is therefore going to be requiring a transformation of our current agricultural systems. And of course, it also requires robust evidence. And so really, this is sort of where hopefully UK CEH comes in. So Ag Zero Plus is a strategic research programme which builds on the success of the ASSIST programme that I just mentioned, and which you'll hear a lot more detail about from Ben in a moment. It's a very much collaborative programme lasting over 5 years with about £12 million of what we call national capability funding. So this is coming from the UK Research and Innovation through the Natural Environment Research Centre and BBSRC, the Biological Sciences Research Centre. And Research Council, and our partners on Ag Zero Plus, as with ASSIST, are Rothamsted Research, the British Geological Survey, and also now we're working with the National Centre for Earth Observation and Plymouth Marine Laboratory, which brings some really powerful integrated elements like catchment level research and satellite mapping capability into the programme. So as I was saying, it's very much an integrated programme, which is looking from crops and livestock science across the socioeconomics of innovative farming systems, using earth observation, ground sensors, emissions, measurement, and mapping of pollution, across to, of course, measuring biodiversity and natural capital. And the data science and modelling that arises from the programme is a really also critical part of what we're doing. And very much at the heart of the building up that this portfolio of research has been building a community of practice and working from the outset with farmers, industry, and of course other colleagues in the science and policy interface. So overall, the kind of overall aim of Ag Zero Plus is to provide data, models and tools and the infrastructure to support this transition to productive, net zero and less polluting agriculture. And critically, whilst enhancing biodiversity and soil and water health. So that's where the Net Zero Plus comes in, is this element of not only meeting net zero targets, but also enhancing these other critical elements of the ecosystem. So the approach, as I've already mentioned, is very much integrated. Can't quite see my slide with the we have a kind of multi-scale design in which we're going to embracing this concept of living farm labs across the programme to test innovative management approaches. So we have a range of work going from plot scale experiments across large farm estates or landscapes, right through to whole farm systems being tested, and then study catchments, which again, all three of these you'll probably hear a little bit more about as Ben and Richard introduce their research. It's, as I said, very participatory. We'll show you a bit later how to get involved. And importantly, with the kind of modelling and the monitoring that's going on in the background, we want to be able to quantify the trade-offs between food production, looking at crop yield, emissions, pollution, and soil and water health, and of course with biodiversity in there as well. So just a kind of schematic to go through. As I said, data is really at the heart of Ag Zero Plus in terms of the outputs that we can produce for the research community and of course for yourselves as farmers and the industry as well. So we're building on existing national data sets, but providing some really exciting new contextual national data sets on elements of biodiversity, natural capital, emissions, and all that data will be open source. We're then kind of covering this farm scale accounting of innovations, as I say, across quite a large number of farms where we've got various different degrees of survey and monitoring going on. So from using professional surveys from our researchers through to working with farmers to use some of the farmer-led survey tools that we're developing, and also sensors on farm machinery and our really exciting Skyline system, which Rich will introduce you to for measuring greenhouse gas flux. The data integration analysis part is obviously something which UKCEH are really proud that we have a really great sort of capability to be able to use APIs and data pipelines and machine learning now to bring some of these huge scale complex data sets together. A lot of them are very much real time generating, again, huge amounts of data, which we're building the capacity to process. And then an exciting element of Ag0 Plus is to be able to produce these farm scale environmental audits, which again, I won't say any more because Rich is going to talk a lot more about those, I think, a bit later. Critically, we're enabling this kind of co-design of solutions and decision support tools that we can make available to you. Yeah, with the obvious end goal. Just moving on to really quickly show you where have we been. We've been out and about so far since Ag0 started. We had a great time at Groundswell last year. This is our colleague Tom August, who's actually just behind Tom. You can see what we call the AMI trap, or an autonomous monitoring system for monitoring moths. This is some really, again, exciting new technology, which is using AI to decode the moth images and provide really quite novel real-time data. So a really popular talk at Groundswell last year, and also John Redhead, who's leading all of our work on mapping and tools. Again, you'll hear some about more of the tools in a moment. Lots of engagement with farmers so far, which has been fantastic, and we're also really proud to have some of our tools and the Ag0 logo represented at COP28 recently. We have been really excited to continue our work with our great colleague Marek Nowakovski, who again I know David is very familiar with. And if I've got about 30 seconds, I'd just like to play you this video, which we put together as part of a series with Marek.
For over 50 years, I've been working in the science of crop production, and my passion has always been about increasing wildlife alongside profitable agriculture. In this series, I'll be exploring practical ways that farmers can reduce their carbon footprint, make best use of pesticides, and help bring wildlife back to their farms.
So that was just a little introduction. This is a new video series that we started producing last summer with Marek, and in each of the short 3-minute subsequent videos and films, Marek is effectively featured talking and interviewing either some of the farmers that are working with us on these research programs or the scientists themselves. So if you dig into that YouTube channel, you can see Julian Gold, one of our fabulous farmers down the road at East Hendred, talking about infield wildflower strips. You can see Ben talking about encouraging beneficial insects, our colleagues John and Tom talking about the tools and the monitoring I've just mentioned, and also the latest one is about soil carbon. We've got another one to come on hedgerows, and so effectively, yeah, please do watch that space, and I hope you can enjoy sharing those videos a little bit more widely. If you want to find out more, we have the Ag0 Plus website, and I think Dan's going to help us share some of these resources potentially after the webinar. Do get involved. There's a Get Involved page on the website. There are many different routes through which, again, you might be able to get involved, and hopefully that will be clear. Or just come and talk to us. Just send us an email, and of course, follow us through the UKCEH social media accounts. That'd be fantastic. And I'll finish by saying thank you for listening, and thank you, of course, to our funders, our research partners on Ag0 Plus, and of course, all of those stakeholders, including LEAF, who've already been engaging with the research programme. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. That was brilliant. A lot of resources there. I'll certainly be heading to the YouTube channel. So we'll hand over to Ben now.
Brilliant, thank you. Right. Can people see that? Cool, excellent. Yeah, so thank you for inviting us to talk to you today. I'm going to talk to you about improving natural pest control, principally in the context of arable farming systems, and in particular about some of the innovations that we've been developing through the Assist project, infield flower strips in particular, and also the role moving forward of how farmer recording is, got this potential to improve the value of natural pest control, and at least how viable it is in farming systems. So there's kind of while this is probably quite obvious to most of you, there's this issue of why bother promoting natural pest control? There are existing control methods available. Obviously we've got a whole suite of, in the most very effective insecticide chemical control methods. So at a core level, there is a fundamental need to produce food. Undeniably, agriculture needs to produce food. It needs to be profitable. It needs to maintain livelihoods of people. No one is denying that. That is critical. But this does come at a cost to biodiversity. And this has come at a cost that is obviously being softened in recent years, but historically has been quite intense. Certainly, if you go back kind of into the 70s and 80s, those impacts would have been very severe. Now, while there's a lot of things that impact on biodiversity declines, the use of chemical control methods is undeniably one of those factors. There's wide evidence to show that it has negative effects, and it's not a surprise. You are effectively applying something to control an insect pest, and there's a lot of other non-target insects present within those systems. Now, this is a reason in itself to try and think about natural pest control as an option to not necessarily stop using insecticides, but to create a greater reliance on natural pest control so we can move away from such dependence on those. There's other reasons to think about this as well. There's the withdrawal of pesticides from the market. This is something that's happened repeatedly, and it's not necessarily withdrawal, but often products simply just don't get renewed when they reach the end of their regulatory approval period. There's also issues of build-up of resistance. If you do not have this fallback of natural pest control, at least to help support the control of kind of pernicious insects, this is something that then potentially becomes a problem. So increasing reliance on natural pest control methods is really something that is a potential win-win situation. So this figure here, natural pest control, invertebrates damage 18% of world crops, so worth 77 billion. I think that's quite an old figure, and I suspect that is a massive underestimate at a world scale. But you get the idea. Obviously, there is a reason why insecticides are widely used. They are necessary to control the impacts of damaging pests on crops. And natural pest control has an opportunity to fit into that space and reduce the impact of pests. I think what is really critical here, and I'm going to say, organic farming is great, but the majority of the work that we do at UKCEH is focused at conventional farming systems that use insecticide control methods. Very much natural pest control is not an either-or situation. It works in the context of conventional farming practices, and it's something that can be actively promoted. It is also something that is a key aspect of integrated pest management systems. It's not the only, obviously, component of integrated pest management systems, but it is a critical component of that. And also it's something that is being actively promoted through the new SIFI incentives. So you've got integrated pest management plan. You also got the new no insecticides on arable crops, as well as payments for active management practices that can help promote natural pest control, such as infield strips, which is a relatively new one in the context of agri-environment schemes, and also obviously fill margins, which is a much older one. So supporting natural pest control, what is the critical component of this? Well, the kind of over extended periods of time over the Green Revolution, there has been a simplification of agricultural systems. There has been a loss of those availability of semi-natural habitats. And obviously a lot of agri-environmental schemes have been very much orientated to trying to reintroduce those into agricultural systems. And why do we need to do that? Well, most of these species cannot persist purely in the crop. Fundamentally, your crop gets harvested, and even if you've got something like a minimum tillage practice or you're using cover crops, they still need somewhere to survive, to overwinter. They need refuge sites, and they need places to feed outside of the crop when, for example, the crop is harvested or there's not much in there to feed on. And as a result, the use of or creation of these semi-natural habitats, stuff like grass margin strips, but probably more to a greater extent, more complex flower margin strips, all the way down to complex things like grassland restoration, like the re-establishment of species-rich grasslands. All of these practices create those semi-natural habitats. Now, where something like fill margins really come in is you can establish something in direct proximity to the field. And so it provides an opportunity to not only increase populations of predatory insects, parasitic insects, but it gives that opportunity for them to directly move into the crop. So what are the kind of things we're talking about? Obviously, you are probably going to be very familiar with the fill margins. You might be less familiar with the infill strips. So this is something we've been very much developing and pushing through the Assist project that Claire mentioned, which was the precursor to Ag Zero. The idea between these is having these infield strips that run through the middle of fields and provide an opportunity for predatory insects to move into the field and then move out into the crop. But as I said, this middle picture is a grassland restoration, again, something else that will help promote these kind of things. So what's the evidence? Why is natural pest control work? There's a huge amount of evidence underlying this, but this is just a few examples of work we've done. One of the things that we can do is we can artificially establish pest colonies on crops, which we've done before. Looking at wheat, we artificially establish aphids. And then we look to see at the extent to which the control of these pests occurs under different situations. So we can compare that with situations where we have field margins that are enhanced, they've got loads of flowers within them, and it's important to remember a lot of predatory insects need to feed on pollen and nectar. So it's not just that they feed on insects, they will also need these other resources, and compare those to grass-only strips. And one of the things that we find is that in the enhanced margins with flowers, lots of diversity of plant species, we get much more availability of these surface active predators, beetles, these kind of things that are critical for providing pest control. What we also find is that when you look at these artificial aphid colonies that we've established, what actually happens in terms of the survival of those colonies? We find that typically, if you've got fill margins that are very diverse, what's just highlighted here, the colonies of aphids survive very short periods of time. And also when you move further into the crop, about 50 meters into the crop, although you've got less penetration of these beneficial insects, the survival is still better than what you would see with the grass-only margin. So enhancing these beneficial insects is really critical to providing pest control. What's also interesting is that each individual insect is very different and they can respond in different ways to typical management practices, such as the use of insecticides. This was a study that we did where we compared a whole suite of different predatory insects, typical ones that you find in agricultural land, and we looked at the rate at which they fed on little insects, basically aphids. What was their effective consumption of aphids? And we compared that after a sublethal dose of an insecticide. And the idea was to try and see with these typical kind of exposures that you see in agricultural situations under normal management practices, how long does it take for these predatory insects to bounce back in their ability to feed on insects? So we looked at feeding rates after 1 day and 5 days. And this is a measure of the resilience of these systems. And we find some really interesting things here. We find that for some species, they're unaffected. They keep eating insects at exactly the same rate after these sublethal exposures to a kind of pyrethroid. We find for some species, they get a depression, they feed less, but then they bounce back relatively quickly. And we also find that for other ones, they get a depression. So after 5 days, they continue to feed much less. Now, this is really important because for some of these species that are feeding much less, these are ones that are some of the commonest in systems. And what this really points to is that you need a diversity of species. You need to support a lot of predatory insect species because they all have different ways of responding to these environments. If you've got that diversity, it provides resilience in pest control in conjunction with your conventional control practices of using insecticides. So that's all kind of some of the theory where it's little experiments and those kind of things that show that natural pest control works. But there's a big question of how does this actually start working when you roll it out into real world situations? Is this something that's viable? And I'm going to show 2 pieces of evidence that really underpin this. So the first one is from the Hillston Farm platform. Now, this is a study that was undertaken, driven by Richard Pywell, quite a while ago now, actually. But this is one of the first studies that really did a landscape scale manipulative approach to try and understand how promoting beneficial insects in agricultural situations can have a beneficial effect on yield. Now, this farm was 1,000 hectare on kind of heavy clay soils. And prior to the start of this study, it had never really been part of any agri-environmental scheme. So it provided this great opportunity to test whether agri-environmental schemes at the time, kind of effectively entry-level schemes, so the creation of kind of fill margins and wildflower strips, does that have a benefit on biodiversity? And it was very much orientated towards biodiversity. So what they did was split this farm into 5 blocks. And then in each of those blocks, they created little farmlets of 50 to 60 hectares where they could replicate 3 different treatments: a control, business as usual, kind of conventional farm management, a 3% of land out of production converted to these kind of wildlife habitats, these flower strips, these field corners, and then a more complex 8% of land out of production. So the 3% was very close to ELS at the time, and 8% probably closer to HLS, but at the time we called it an kind of ELS extra. And very much the choice of where these margins and these created strips was going was dictated by the farmers. So typically in the low yielding areas of the land. Now, while this was orientated towards trying to understand the benefits of entry-level schemes and higher-level schemes to supporting biodiversity, because these farms had detailed yield mapping, we could also look to see whether this had knock-on benefits by promoting natural pest control, by promoting pollination. And what I'm going to show here is probably an interaction between those two. So by looking at these yield maps, we could compare this replicated landscape scale block design to see different effects. Now, what you see here is a graph, and this is looking at regional yield averages. So anything along this one line is the regional yield average taken across the crops that are growing on the site. So that's winter wheat, oilseed rape, and field beans as well. What we find is that for this 0% of land out of production, it's kind of ticking along. It doesn't really change over time. Over this period from 2006 to 2011, it's a bit below the regional average, but it ticks on about this line. Where we find is that for 3% of land out production and 8% of land out production, you get this gradual increase in the yield productivity of the land. And it's important to note here, this is taking into account the fact that we've taken land out of production. So what I think is really important to note here is that it takes time for these effects to kick in. They are not an instantaneous thing. You need to create these key habitats, and then it takes time for populations of beneficial insects, predatory insects, pollinators to build up and increase over that time. Now, this is a really important study. It's large-scale replicated block design. I don't think this kind of thing's ever been repeated since then. But what this is focused on one site. And as part of the ASSIST project, we're interested to see whether this is replicated across a large number of other sites. So we enhanced this experimental design and replicate it elsewhere. And what we were doing here was looking at 3 different systems of agriculture. And these are kind of close, the more extreme one, to kind of the regenerative agriculture side of things. We again had our cross-compliance, nothing's being done here. This is typical farm management. We had a second treatment where we had out-of-crop enhancement of biodiversity. So we had the flower-rich field margins around the edges, but we didn't do anything else to try and get the beneficial insects into the crop. And then we had an out-of-crop enhancement with these infield strips. Infield strips separated by 3 boom widths, so about 90 meters on average between them. And the idea of them is to just increase that permeability to get these beneficial insects into the middle of fields and kind of increase the benefit associated with them. Now, as I said, this is a farm system. So in addition to these field margins and these infield strips, in this treatment too, we also looked at the use of cover crops as well for spring sown cereals. And also in the treatment 3, we had cover crops, but we also had farmyard manure or green composted waste applied at 30 tons a hectare very early on within the first year of this treatment. Now, what's critical about this is we are now replicating this across 18 sites over 4 years. So that each farm has its different philosophy to farm management and managing each site in its own way, but we can replicate those treatments and look for consistency across that. We can look at yield differences for cereals and oilseed rape, and we can try and see whether these sustainable management systems, these treatments 2 and 3, have a positive effect on yield. We're measuring effects on biodiversity, but we want to see whether these are having effects on yield. And this is just one example site. It's quite a good one to give you some kind of idea. We've got our control, business as usual. We've got our treatment 2, so cover crops and flower margins, supporting stuff at the edges, but not really actively trying to get beneficial insects into the middle of the fields. And then we had our overall all singing, all dancing kind of system with cover crops, farmyard manure or green composted waste, flower margins, and infield strips. Now, this is quite a good example, but you can see the very poor establishment that we get on treatment of the control, and to an extent on treatment 2 compared to our treatment 3. Now, this is one farm, and again, you can get stuff to work on one farm because you can tailor it to one farm. But what we wanted to see is there a consistent effect over multiple sites? Is there a population level thing that we can generalize to a large number of farms? And what we've got here is kind of a yield effect size differences. So anything sitting along this 0 line here doesn't differ from the control in terms of its yield across those cereals and oilseed rape crops. And what we've seen for the blue bars, this is comparing the control to the treatment. We find on average, we are getting higher levels of yield, particularly as we move along over time. And then this is exasperated when we get to the treatment 3, our all singing, all dancing treatment. Now, obviously, these are system level approaches. There's a lot of different interacting things in here, but what we can do is try and break these effects apart on yield and try and understand direct and indirect effects using a statistical approach. It's something called structural equation modeling. And this is here looking at changes in yield. And what we're looking here is the impact of green infrastructure. So the ratio of these infield strips or fill margins to the area of cropped area within a field. And also fill margin plant diversity, how well fill margins have established. And obviously anybody who's established fill margins will know that they can successfully establish and they can less successfully establish. And often, you know, that can be quite variable. So that's something we try to capture in this. So what we find is that there is a direct effect of this ratio of this green infrastructure, the fill margins, the infield strips, to the ratio to the cropped area on yield. And we also see an indirect effect of that through the amount of worms present within the field. So green infrastructure promotes yield directly, but it also promotes yield by promoting worm count. We find that if you've got this good establishment of fill margins, it increases parasitoid numbers, which increases aphid parasitism in the crop, which also directly impacts on yield. And we also find these fill margins promote both beetle predation rates. This is something we directly measured. And again, that impacts on yield. And again, the ground beetle numbers, the numbers of beetles that we've supported in the field also support increased beetle predation rates. So you've got this complex network of direct and indirect effects. Ground beetle numbers also seem to be positively related to parasitoid numbers and aphid parasitism, although it's likely that's because they share similar habitats. But we also see negative effects. We find that ground beetles will have a negative effect on aphid parasitism. And this is a common thing with natural pest control. A lot of pests are voracious. They go around and they kill everything and they don't distinguish. So sometimes you can have negative effects and sometimes you can have positive effects. We also find some evidence of a decrease in yield for cover crops, but I suspect this is more related to the fact that it's spring cropping. This is something that we need to pull out a little bit more moving forward. Now, one of the things that we're now doing is looking at profit. So while we're seeing a bump in yield, the question is that actually economically viable? Now, our early results suggest that with SIFI payments, yeah, it probably breaks even. So although you're taking land out of production and so you're losing the production of that land as a result of that, when you take into account SIFI payments, it is likely that you're very much breaking even and potentially growing into profit. But this is something that we're looking at now. So one of the things that historically I think has been an issue when you think about natural pest control is it's a bit of a black box. You can establish these fill margins, you can do all this stuff, but you just don't know whether it's working. Are you actually getting an increase in predator numbers, and is that having a benefit? I think very much that's, for a data-driven industry, that has always historically been a problem. It's very hard to make a decision on your management for pests if you're relying on something that you've got very little information on. It might be working, it might not. So one of the things that we're trying to move more towards now is the development of mobile apps that can enable non-specialists in the context of this for identifying or quantifying insects to monitor these, such as natural capital and biodiversity. And what we're doing is taking advantage of massive advantages of AI image recognition technology that can allow extensive user-driven assessment of biodiversity. As already mentioned by Claire, we're doing advances on this for actually biodiversity monitoring. But what I specifically want to talk to you about here is what we're doing to try and assess levels of natural pest control. So this is very much under development at the moment, but this is something that we're moving forward on this. So as I said, natural pest control is very much this kind of black box. You don't know whether it's worked. So what we're trying to do is develop approaches where farmers can go out and they can lay out basically very simple traps to collect ground beetles to get an idea of population levels within individual fields. We're then developing approaches where you can effectively take a photo of that trap content and then and that will identify those species, and we can then ultimately relate that to the abundance of predators, and also for individual species, their efficacy, how effective they're going to be. And you saw that in that earlier slide, different species feed at different rates on different pests. So the idea is that in the long term, we'll be able to link this to thresholds applied for spraying, so that you can make an active decision on where you might have hit a pest threshold, but you know you've got good control, natural pest control, so you can afford to offset the timing of your spraying and potentially offset it to the point beyond which you reach that kind of economic threshold or economic timing for a kind of risk. So this is where we're going in the future, new tools to help inform so that the management of natural pest control is not just a trust your luck thing. It is something that you can actively understand on a field by field basis. So just to summarize, we're very much aware, and I think this is a critical thing, is in the context of farming systems, you can't support biodiversity without considering yield and profitability. These are critical things, and this all needs to feed in the context of this. However, there is an opportunity to actively farm those useful parts of biodiversity, stuff like natural pest control, stuff like pollination, a lot of kind of macroinvertebrates associated with good soil health. Managing actively for them will often have knock-on benefits for wider biodiversity, so it's very much a kind of win-win situation in that. And as a result of this, promoting this kind of natural pest control, it is obviously a key part of IPM and the IFM kind of concept overall. And critically, it's compatible with conventional farming approaches. You know, in the future, this is certainly an opportunity. Insecticides are likely to be critical moving into the future. I can't see a world without them being realistic to feed world populations. But giving opportunities to reduce dependence on them while maintaining those profitable farming systems is where we want to move. Now, I'm going to put a caveat on this. Natural pest control is not the same as going out and spraying an insecticide. It does not have that same consistency from year to year as it is fundamentally a natural process. What is an opportunity to increase those populations to very high levels. So even when you have lull years, you've still got natural pest control. It needs to be taken in this context. It is a natural process, so it does have that variability, and that variability also relates to takes time to establish. To make use of natural pest control, establishing a good management of these field margins, of these infill strips, takes time, and it's an ongoing process. It builds year after year after year. So this is something that needs to be taken into account, and that feeds into this idea that what we're thinking about here is future-proofing your farming systems. You do not know what is going to happen in the future. The loss of active ingredients, development of resistance. If you start relying on this as a last-minute approach, even though it might at the moment be a break-even thing in terms of profitability, certainly with SIFI, it does seem to be a break-even thing. The context is, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if you've been supporting this going on, the reliance on this, particularly if actives are removed or they become less effective, this is where something like this has built future-proofing into those farming systems. So obviously just acknowledgements for kind of huge numbers of people who've been involved with this, and also for all the farmers who actively participate in our research. And it's critical for the work that we underdo. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Ben, sorry, that was absolutely brilliant. The practical application as well was just great to see, often a blocker, I think. So brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Over to you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. And firstly, I'd just like to start by thanking David, Dan and Megan for giving us the wonderful opportunity to become a LEAF Innovation Centre, and also to give us the opportunity to talk about our work in the webinar this morning. So thank you very much, all of you at LEAF. That's really great. So I'm going to talk this morning about our work on measuring and managing greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is very much the work of my colleague Neil McNamara, Chris Evans and Ross Morrison, and also John Redhead, who lead the various elements of this quite a large topic. So if I just move on to the first slide. Yeah. So this is a very simple representation of the greenhouse gas sort of fluxes that come off agricultural land. And as Claire said, agriculture is an important source of UK greenhouse gas emissions. So it's also a very important sink of greenhouse gases as well. And if we're going to achieve low carbon farming systems, we're really going to need to tackle it in two ways. We're going to need to reduce emissions, and there's a whole range of things that farmers are trying and science is testing around this. This is just some examples. Things like changing the diet of livestock with feed additives to reduce methane, smart farming to become more efficient in just fertilizer additions, better nitrogen use efficiency, better fertilizer formulations to reduce emissions. So a whole range of things we can do to reduce emissions. And then also on the other side, we can also do a lot of things to increase carbon capture. And we can look at, how much carbon we're storing in hedges and field margins and agroforestry. And we can also look to see, how tillage affects carbon, putting grass into the rotation or cover crops, how does that change soil carbon stocks? And also, can we enhance carbon capture with things like biochar? So a whole range of things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but a whole range of things that we can do to increase the capture of carbon as well. And these are the sorts of things that we're going to be looking at we are looking at in the Ag Zero Plus program. But what I would say is key to all of this is we need accurate and repeatable measurements of these if we're going to have confidence in changing our farming systems to try and move towards these low carbon, low emission systems. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about our work in measuring and reducing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. And fundamental is the actual measurement of the emissions coming off agriculture. And UK CEH run a national network of eddy-covariance flux towers. So very briefly, eddy-covariance uses micrometeorology to produce field scale assessments of the carbon dioxide, methane, water and energy budgets for whole fields. So it works at the field scale. You put the flux tower in the middle of the field and it produces it measures continuously, and it produces these estimates, these budgets of critical greenhouse gases, water and energy. Now we currently run a network of 54 flux towers across Great Britain, or UK actually, and around 70% of these are on farmed land, with a big focus, as you can see, on the drained peats in East Anglia, but also on arable mineral soils and grassland, and also bioenergy crops as well. The remaining flux towers, the remaining 30% are in wild places, assessing the emissions from things like blanket bogs and fens and salt marshes as well to complete the picture. But the key thing is that these flux towers provide us with 24/7 whole field estimates of real emission factors for agriculture. And we can compare climate smart farming systems, so where you've got grass in the rotation, where you've got cover crops, to more business as usual in paired field approaches. And these emissions can be put into emission factors that we can use for carbon calculations, which is critical for if we're going to go forward and produce these low carbon systems. The other thing we're doing, as well as getting that sort of background measurement of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, is we're looking at ways that agriculture can mitigate its greenhouse gas emissions. So in the Ag Zero Plus program, we're evaluating 6 different nutrient management strategies that we believe have some potential to minimize greenhouse gas emissions whilst maintaining crop productivity. So we're looking in no particular order at urease and nitrification inhibited fertilizer formulations, the effects of green manure on emissions, the effects of biochar incorporation, the effects of sewage digestate, and also bioactivated sewage digestate, where you put silicate in that digestate to improve its its or hopefully its emission factors. And then we're also looking at more conventional practices such as splitting the dose of nitrogen fertilizer, so putting on little and often rather than very large doses infrequently, and also clover undersowing. So there's a blend of quite practical and near horizon approaches and some slightly further horizon approaches like biochar. And what we're doing is we're focusing particularly on nitrous oxide because this is the most important greenhouse gas, the most potent greenhouse gas that agriculture contributes to. We're also looking at carbon dioxide and methane as well, but we're particularly focusing on nitrous oxide because it's 2/3 of nitrous oxide are coming from agriculture. So this is just a flavour of what we're doing. The way we're doing it is we're using new sensor technology, which Claire mentioned, something called the Skyline robotic greenhouse gas sampling system. So basically, traditional greenhouse gas measurements were done by placing a chamber over the crop. This is a picture on the left-hand side, and doing manual measurements where a student or a technician or someone goes along and does a manual measurement as often as they can. And this is very time-consuming and very costly. So we've moved towards this robotic system where a bell jar moves along these Kevlar ropes, and it stops where it reaches one of these plastic collars, and the bell jar drops down over the collar and seals, and we measure the greenhouse gas emission from that relatively small patch of ground. So this enables sort of 24-hour greenhouse gas emissions for up to 36 plots over a whole growing season, which you cannot achieve using traditional measures. The downside of this, we will be totally honest, is that it is the plots are small scale. So what we need to do is use this as a screening approach to pick out the most systems that have the greatest potential to mitigate and abate greenhouse gas emissions, and then scale those up to the field scale and use the flux tower approach then to look at the field scale emissions. So this is our Skyline approach, which we're using very much in Ag Zero Plus. And I only really have time to show you results from one of the 6 trials that we've done. I do have results from the others, but we simply don't have time today. This is the impacts of clover undersowing in winter wheat, and looking at how that affects nitrogen use efficiency, productivity, and N2O emissions. And in summary, what we found here was that if you undersow wheat with white clover, you can afford to reduce your nitrogen fertilizer additions by up to 25% without any noticeable loss of crop productivity. So we believe that the clover is making up for that difference in a lower nitrogen addition. And by putting on less nitrogen fertilizer, you reduce your N2O emissions by around 20%. Now, what I would say is these were small plots. This was 1 year in one crop on one soil type. And what we need to do is now work with farmers to scale this on commercial fields and see whether this benefit is actually being replicated on these at this larger scale. But that's just an example of the sort of data we can get from Skyline and the sort of information we can feed in. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is ways we can increase carbon capture in soils, in agricultural soils, and also how do we measure this, which is quite an interesting topic. So firstly, the sort of fundamentals. Estimating soil carbon stocks in agriculture at the national scale is an important starting point because it enables us to benchmark where agriculture is and importantly where it could go. How much carbon could we store in agricultural soils? So UK CEH has worked with our collaborators, Reading Agricultural Consultants and remote sensing application consultants. And what we've done is we've produced a prototype soil carbon model which provides estimates of soil carbon stocks at 0 to 25 and 25 to 50 centimetres for every field across Great Britain. And this is driven by around 8,000 actual physical soil carbon samples that we've analysed in a whole range of different situations, land uses and cropping systems. And this number is ever growing. this carbon, these carbon sample numbers are ever growing. So the more samples we can get, the better the model gets. The model takes account of soil type, texture, topography, and climate. So where is the site? Where is the field? It also takes account of both the current land use, whether it's an improved grassland, arable field, woodland, or semi-natural habitat. And it takes account of the previous land use going back 30 years. So if you are an improved grassland, how long have you been sown as a ley? It also takes account for arable fields of the cropping history for the last 9 years using the UK CEH crop map, which we produce every year. And recently we've introduced, we're able to detect cover crops over the last 9 years. So for each field, it will know how often cover crops have been grown. So we can feed that into the model prediction. And finally, we are looking at whether we can detect zero tillage and minimum tillage as well. That is in development though. And so importantly, the model can be used to forecast, the what if question. Here is my carbon stock today, but what if I put grass in the rotation? What if I put cover crops in? What if I take the land out of production and plant trees? And the model in its current guise is around 70% accurate based on our testing, but we're trying to develop the model and improve its accuracy all the time. So this is our carbon stocks model. And this is what the model actually looks like. This is the Tame catchment, quite near Wallingford, around Aylesbury. And the deeper the purple colour, the higher the carbon stocks. And what we've done is we've pulled out the Wadston estate. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner. And you can see there's quite a lot of variation in soil carbon stocks across the estate, with the higher stocks tending to be associated with permanent pasture in the river valleys and some of the woodland on the estate. But as I say, this is just an example of the sort of product we have, which enables benchmarking of carbon stocks at the beginning of any land management changes. So I'm also going to give you a few of our results looking at a couple of interventions which could increase carbon stocks in arable or in farmland. So we did a quick study on the effects of grassland age on soil carbon. So that would reflect, what if I put grass into my rotation? And also we've looked at how carbon stocks accumulate under field margins of different age. So they're the two studies I'm going to rapidly present to you. So the first one, what is the relationship between grassland age and soil carbon stocks? We worked with Arla and we looked at 3 dairy farms which are Arla are owned by Arla or Arla owners. And in each one, we developed, or we found, a time series of which went from arable land, so where there was arable, and then grasslands of different ages. All the grasslands were managed fairly intensively because these were dairy farms, so they were receiving around 150 kilograms of N per hectare. So on each farm, we found 10 fields of different ages, and we sampled those intensively, and we measured carbon, nitrogen, and bulk density, and we fractionated the carbon to look at different carbon pools in the soil. This is very quickly how we measured the carbon. So 10 cores per field. We sectioned the cores in different depths. We air dried them, sieved them. Most importantly, we separated the stones and calculated the bulk density. And then we calculated the carbon stocks and nitrogen, and we did the fine mineral fraction of the soil to look at the stability of the carbon stock. So quite intensive measurements. This is the results from Buxton. So soil carbon stocks are on the y-axis, and the age of the grassland from 0 to 15 years is on the x-axis. And you can see very clearly that what happens is that there's a rapid accumulation of carbon stocks following reseeding of the arable land to grass, and then that slows down after around 15 years. And what we found across the 3 sites is that the finer textured soils, the silts and clays, had a greater potential to store carbon, so they could store more carbon than the sandier, the coarser textured soils. And this is the ability for the carbon to bond with the mineral fraction. So it's an important consideration when you're looking at carbon sequestration. The other study we've done is looking at how field margins might capture carbon, and we did 2 detailed studies, one on the Hillston platform, which Ben has mentioned, and one at the Earth Trust. And we're fortunate on these sites that we know the history of the field margins, and these field margins, there are many of them, and they range in age from relatively young field margins, less than 10 years old, right the way up to some of the earliest field margins that were sown that were around 30 years old. And we compared these field margins to the adjacent arable crop. And in this case, we did deep soil carbon down to 1 meter. So this was a change in our approach. And we looked at soil organic carbon and texture and bulk density. These are the results from Hillsdon. This is the crop you can see. And the thing to notice here is that you do get carbon all the way down to 1 meter, albeit not a huge amount, but you do get carbon down there. But there is obviously more carbon in the surface, and this is reflective of the straw incorporation and the minimum tillage that the farm is undertaking. When you compare the crop to the field margin, there is always more carbon at all depths in the field margin, but the differences aren't actually that massive when you look across all of the field margins at Hillsdon. But when we split the margins by age, you can see actually there's around 20% more carbon in the older margins. The margins go up to about 18 years at Hillsdon. We're waiting for the results from Earth Trust, but we suspect that difference will increase as you get up to 30 years. But it's interestingly, the carbon accumulation under arable field margins is significantly slower than the grass lays from the ARLA study. And I'm hypothesizing here that this could be to do with nitrogen limitation, in that those reseeded grasslands on the dairy farms are getting a dose of nitrogen, and that's encouraging root growth and above ground growth, and that's putting more carbon into the soil compared to a field margin which gets no nitrogen fertilizer. So the final part of my talk is about whole farm carbon and environmental auditing. We believe it's absolutely critical to take a whole farm approach if we're looking at carbon and the environment as well, rather than just one field and one farming practice in isolation. So Claire mentioned this in her talk, but under the Ag Zero Plus program, we've developed, or we are developing, a whole farm environmental and carbon auditing system. And indeed, this is a shameless plug. We are looking for farmers who would like to work with us to help us develop this auditing system. So we'd like to work with you to look at how you would like the data reported, what sort of metrics you would like, and what's important to you. So if you're interested in joining the prototype auditing that we're doing, it's all anonymous. We will not be sort of making your names and addresses available to anyone else. It will all be anonymized, as I say. Please get in touch with Claire or I after the webinar. But the environmental audit that we're proposing and we've now started to develop comprises 3 parts: detailed habitat mapping, both crop mapping and non-crop habitats. This is taking account of the natural capital, so natural capital inventory, using the latest high-resolution commercial satellite data and LiDAR data, so we get above-ground biomass for all of the hedges and all of the woodlands on the farm. And then we move into whole farm audits. So we've built a data pipeline to Gatekeeper and Muddy Boots, so we can very easily, without a lot of fuss, access farm management data from the farms, and we can do audits of food production efficiency, so carbon dioxide emissions per calorie produced, or any metric. We can also plug the farm's data into a new carbon calculator, which is taking the revised emission factors we're picking up from the Flux Tower network to give UK-based emission data and carbon calculations, which is a step forward. We're also linking this to real-time climate data, because soil moisture and climate drive a lot of the N2O emissions. So it's very important to bring the real-time data in. We will link to the carbon stock model that you've seen, and we've also got a pollution risk model. So we've got a risk assessment for the pesticide program the farm is using to help make decisions about reducing the risk of pesticide effects on biodiversity. And we also have biodiversity metrics. So whole farm audits being done there. And then finally, we have developed environmental opportunity mapping, which is based on our ePlanner system. So we can provide the farm with maps where we can look at the suitability for alternative carbon neutral and biodiversity friendly management options, such as planting trees, resource protection, and pollinator habitat. So very quickly, this is what it looks like, 3-meter mapping for a farm in the Cotswolds. So you can see that what it's done is it's able to pull out all of the headlands and the field margins and the hedges and the wild bird food patches on the farm, which are quite time consuming to map. And we can do this using satellite data and take account of these very, very rapidly and produce a rapid inventory of the farm and all its crops and non-cropped habitats. Similarly, we have got a new hedgerow product coming out at the end of January, which for every farm in England, sorry, not Great Britain, in England at the moment, we can provide the lengths and heights of all of the hedges. And you can see this also picks out individual veteran trees in the hedgerows as well. So again, this is important if we're looking at carbon code, hedgerow code, carbon calculations and things like that. We can get the above ground biomass for the farm from the length and height of all of the hedges. Whole farm audits, as I've mentioned, the data pipeline to Gatekeeper and Muddy Boots, so it's very easy for the farm to link up with us. We can analyze crop yield and identify consistently low yielding areas of the farm. We've got the above ground biomass from the high-res satellite. We can build that or link that to the new greenhouse gas emission models that we're developing with new emission factors for GB crops and regenerative practices coming from the Flux Tower network. We've got the carbon stock model, so we can take account of how much carbon is offsetting the emissions, pesticide risk model, and the biodiversity calculation, which we can use, which can benchmark the farm. Finally, environmental opportunity mapping. This is the e-planner. That's the web link to it, so please go and take a look at it. It's a free-to-view map-based tool which presents relative suitability for a range of land management options. Works on desktop or mobile devices. You can take it out into the field, and it's there to streamline environmental farm planning and decision making. So currently 5 suitability maps are presented to the farm: flower-rich habitat, woodlands, wild bird food, water resource protection, wet grassland, creation for natural flood management. This is what 4 of those suitability maps look like. Woodland creation is in the top left. Red is high suitability, blue is low suitability. You can see that it's picking out the fringe of the woodland as the most suitable place on this farm for planting trees based on the environmental data it has. Water resource protection is picking out the fields on this is a south-facing scarp slope on the Pewsey Downs. It's picking out these fields on the scarp slope for sowing cover crops to protect the river at the bottom of the slopes. Flower-rich habitat, pretty much all of the map is suitable except for the north side of the wood, which is shown as shady and is coming out as blue. And wet grassland restoration, it's picking out the river valley grasslands in the bottom as the best place for natural flood management to create more of these wet grasslands. So conclusions, if we're going to manage greenhouse gases and carbon, we need accurate and repeatable measurements. There are several of the emission abatement practices that we've been testing with Skyline are showing some really interesting promise, and we need to test these at field scale on real farms. So please get in touch with Claire or myself if you're interested. Reseeding pasture did rapidly capture carbon in the soil, but it leveled off after about 15 years. I'd be very interested to see how herbal lays perform, because we were looking at just ryegrass. So I think there's a place for herbal lays there where we're not putting on as much nitrogen. Carbon capture is slower in arable field margins, and I think that could be to do with nitrogen limitation. Textures are important for controlling how much carbon you can capture in the soil. We're finer with clay and silt soils actually having more potential than sandy soils, and a whole farm system approach is required if we're going to achieve low carbon farming systems where we combine emission reduction with increased carbon capture in the soils and non-crop habitats. Finally, I'd just like to thank the Ag0 Plus team. It's a great team effort, and it's it is really good to work with all our partners across the different research institutes. Thank you very much.